Hey guys, tonight we start with a breath. Not just any breath, but that involuntary gasp when ice-cold water hits your skin and your body forgets how to be calm. You know the moment. You've probably seen it online. Day 30 of cold showers changed my life. Ice bath challenge at 5 a.m. Discipline over comfort. The screen shakes, the teeth chatter, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the internet convinces you there's magic in the cold. And maybe there is. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the Moonlight and Sleepless television channel, and I will deliver as you wish. Also, tell me in the comments, what city are you in, and what time is it there right now? I want to know who's listening to this story and from how far away. Now, dim the lights, and as the night stretches on, let's gently step into tonight's journey together. Let's start with something modern. In January 2020, searches for cold shower benefits on Google spiked by over 300%. That wasn't random. Influencers, athletes, biohackers everyone was talking about cold exposure like it was a miracle drug. It became a kind of internet ritual. Strip down, hit record, step into the cold, survive, and then share. Ice baths, frozen lakes, shower confessionals with steamy breath and trembling voices. But behind the viral videos was something older, much older. Cold water isn't new. What's new is forgetting that we've always had a relationship with it. Anthropologists now believe that prehistoric humans frequently immersed themselves in cold streams not for thrill, but necessity. Rivers were water sources, hunting grounds, spiritual borders. To cross them meant surviving not just the temperature, but something deeper, the shock of the unfamiliar. That same jolt, the one that makes your lungs lock and your heart race, was seen by many early cultures as a kind of reset, not just physical, but psychological. In fact, the first written record of cold immersion used as therapy dates back over 3,000 years ago in an Egyptian medical papyrus. Physicians of the time described shock water as a way to treat both fever and melancholia. What they were really describing might have been the early understanding of nervous system recalibration. They didn't have the language, but they had the instinct. Fast forward a bit. In ancient India, bathing in cold rivers at dawn was, and still is, tied to purification. The Ganges River, for example, isn't just water, it's divine. The act of plunging into it before the sun rises isn't about bravery. It's about starting over. And yet, the modern cold shower movement often strips away that spiritual weight, turning it into a checklist item. Something productive, something to post about. But the core idea? That's been with us forever. There's a reason our bodies react the way they do. When icy water hits skin, nerve endings send panic signals to the brain. Blood rushes inward, breathing shortens, the heart races. But within seconds, if you stay, the body recalibrates. The chaos makes space for stillness. This is where things get fascinating. Some scientists argue that cold immersion triggers a unique physiological state simultaneously alert and calm, a balance between sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic release. You're awake but focused, activated but centered. That might explain why so many people report post-cold shower clarity or euphoria. But the academic world doesn't fully agree. Many studies show conflicting data. Some report metabolic benefits, others say the effects are placebo. One paper even noted that cultural expectation plays a massive role if you believe cold showers are powerful. They likely will be. As one researcher noted, perhaps cold water doesn't give us power. Perhaps it returns us to the moment we feel most alive when comfort is stripped away. That's a feeling. And feelings, as you'll see tonight, have always been part of history. So maybe it's no wonder that today's cold shower enthusiasts echo phrases spoken centuries ago. Not about toughness, but transformation. Because when you step into the cold, you meet yourself. Not the version you perform, the one that breathes, the one that endures. And that, perhaps, is where the magic begins. In the dry wind of the Peloponnese, under a sky the color of bronze, young boys stood barefoot on stone. Their tunics thin, their eyes focused, their backs straight. It was morning in Sparta, and the water they were about to bathe in, ice cold. To us it might seem cruel. To them, it was a beginning. The ancient Spartans are often romanticized as warriorsmen sculpted by hardship, raised to fight, to obey, to endure. But what many forget is how deeply cold water was woven into that endurance. It wasn't just hygiene. It was ideology. Spartan boys, as young as 7, were enrolled in the Agogia rigorous military training system. They were taken from their families, placed in groups, fed minimal rations, and subjected to a life of controlled discomfort. Their bodies were hardened, their emotions restrained, and one of the earliest rituals they faced? Cold bathing. Historical sources describe this in brief but telling detail. Boys were made to wash in icy water, often before sunrise, regardless of the season. Warm water was considered indulgent, dangerous even. It softened the will, dulled the senses. In Spartan logic, heat made boys weak. Cold made them alert, responsive, precise. Some scholars debate the extent of this practice. Was it truly universal, or a later invention by historians mythologizing Spartan severity? The answer isn't clear. There's still disagreement. But multiple ancient writers, Plutarch among them, refer to cold water rituals not as punishment, but as preparation. Here, cold wasn't just a sensation. It was a philosophy, and it worked its way into everything. Cold baths, cold food, cold greetings. To live in coldness was to live in clarity. To resist comfort was to grow in strength. Even the public bathhouses in Sparta, unlike the lavish steam chambers of Athens or Rome, were Spartan in both form and temperature. No tiles, no heat, just stone basins and water pulled from underground springs. For the Spartans, exposure to discomfort trained the soul as much as the body. Their climate was temperate, but their culture was austere. The Agoge wasn't just about combat, it was about forming a mind that didn't flinch. And cold water was a daily reminder. Endurance is not about survival, it's about choice. Interestingly, there's a modern psychological term for this: voluntary stress exposure. In small, controlled doses, putting yourself through challenge cold, fasting, heat can rewire how your brain responds to adversity. You recover faster. You panic less. You adapt. The Spartans didn't have neuroscience, but they had instinct. And cold water, it seems, was one of their earliest teachers. But there's more to this than just toughness. Because buried in the silence of a pre-dawn Spartan bath, there's another idea: ritual clarity. In many ancient cultures, cold water wasn't just for resilience. It was for transition, a moment to mark a threshold boyhood to manhood, ignorance to awareness. Step into the cold and you become something else. That may explain why modern cold plunge devotees often speak in metaphors. It resets me. It burns the noise away. It makes me feel real again. It's not unlike what a young Spartan might have felt, standing still while the cold bit at his skin, staring into a future that asked him to be more than humanto, be unshakable. So yes, cold water stings, but it also clears. And for the Spartans, that clarity wasn't optional. It was the first and final step toward discipline, a liquid mirror, reflecting the self they were becoming. The Romans loved luxury. Marble halls, heated floors, wine served in glass goblets, but perhaps nowhere did their taste for pleasure and sophistication show more than in their bathing culture. Public baths or thermal weren't just for cleaning. They were social hubs, architectural marvels, and, curiously, sites of thermal experimentation. Because, in between the hot pools and steam rooms, there was always a basin of cold water. They called it the Frigidarium. And it wasn't just there for contrast. It was ritual. A Roman bath followed a sequence: Caldarium, hot; Tepidarium, warm; Frigidarium, cold. You sweat in the heat, relaxed in the warm, and braced yourself for the cold. The final plunge sealed the process. It shocked the system awake. And yet, even today, scholars debate: was this sequence about health, or was it just habit? The truth might be both. Roman physicians like Galen, who wrote extensively about health in the 2nd century, believed in the balance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To stay healthy, one had to regulate these with food, sleep, exercise, and temperature. A cold bath wasn't random, it was medicine. According to Galen, plunging into cold water after heat tightened the skin, sealed the pores, and reinvigorated the heart. It brought the body back from the looseness of heat. It closed the body, he wrote, so the spirit may not escape. That phrase, so the spirit may not escape, tells us something else. For the Romans, the physical and metaphysical were never far apart. They weren't just refreshing their limbs. They were anchoring their presence. Modern science backs some of this up. Studies show that moving from hot to cold water stimulates vasoconstriction, a tightening of blood vessels that improves circulation, alerts the nervous system, and can lead to a brief spike in mood-related hormones. But not all researchers agree on the long-term effects. Some argue the benefits are overstated. Others point out that much depends on the individual's baseline health. So while the mechanism is still debated, the experience is undeniable. Step from steam into cold and your body snaps into the now. And it wasn't just the elite enjoying these moments. Public baths were for all citizens, rich and poor. The grand ones, like the baths of Caracalla or Diocletian, could accommodate thousands at once. Visitors moved through marble corridors, past mosaics and columns, from room to room, until they reached the Frigid, a quiet, domed space where cold water waited in stillness. The plunge was symbolic. You entered warmth to loosen yourself. You entered cold to claim yourself. Some historians now describe Roman baths as sensory architecture spaces designed to move the mind through temperature and texture. The contrast between the environments created mental states, emotional releases. The cold water wasn't an afterthought. It was the punctuation mark. And interestingly, there are records of Roman soldiers using cold streams to recover after long marches. Not for enjoyment, for function, to reduce swelling, to restore focus. So the cold had layers: luxury, healing, discipline. And today, in modern spas and wellness centers around the world, we've recreated this sequence without fully knowing why. Hot tub, cold plunge, sauna, ice bath. The Romans did it first. And perhaps they understood something we're just remembering. That the body, when moved through contrast, finds itself again. In cold, the senses wake. In cold, memory sharpens. In cold, there's a return not just to the body, but to attention. And for a civilization obsessed with power, order, and ritual, that moment of return was everything. Far north, where winter stretches for months and darkness sinks deep into the land, there's a sound that marks tradition. The hiss of steam, followed by the sudden gasp of a human body meeting ice. Not in private spas or urban saunas, but in forests, beside frozen lakes, under skies filled with northern light. This is Nordic cold water culture, and it is ancient. You've probably seen the modern version. Smiling Finns jumping into icy holes after a sauna session, their breath forming clouds, their skin flushed red. It seems joyful, almost playful, but its roots go much deeper into ritual, survival, and something close to spiritual practice. In Finland, Sweden, and parts of Norway, the hot sauna cold plunge sequence is more than routine. It's identity. Some historians trace its origins to prehistoric times, when early Finno-Ugric tribes would sit in smoke-filled wooden huts before rolling in snow or stepping into cold streams. The act wasn't recreational. It was renewal. And even now, many Nordic families continue the tradition weekly. Grandparents, children, entire generations sweating, then braving the ice. But what's remarkable is the emotional clarity they often describe: afterward quiet, calm, completely present. Anthropologists refer to this as thermal ritual transition. In simpler terms, the body is shocked, then soothed, and the mind becomes silent. It's no surprise, then, that in Sami shamanic traditions native to northern Scandinavia, cold water immersion was once believed to dislodge bad spirits. Entering a frozen lake after sweat and chant was a way to cleanse not only the skin, but the energetic self. Modern science, again, tries to explain this. Cold exposure releases norepinephrine, which heightens alertness. Blood vessels constrict, then dilate, boosting circulation. Heart rate surges, then steadies. And after, the brain often responds with a chemical cocktail of calm. But is that why people keep doing it? Or is there something deeper? Because if you ask a 75-year-old Finn why she plunges into the lake every Tuesday, she won't talk about hormones. She'll say, "It helps me remember I'm alive." And that idea that cold reminds us of our mortality has persisted for centuries. In Viking lore, there's a term, Kaldur 10, literally cold tooth. It referred to the sting of wind or water so sharp it felt like biting into your bones. Warriors welcomed it. Poets feared it. But no one ignored it. Even today, this relationship with cold is culturally reinforced. In Sweden, children nap outside in winter. In Norway, newborns are sometimes given drops of cold water on their foreheads, a quiet gesture of resilience. In Lapland, reindeer herders drink melted snow without boilingen, old belief that it preserves the fire within. Of course, not all historians agree on the symbolic origins of these practices. Some argue the sauna cold plunge dynamic only became widespread in the 18th or 19th century when access to public bathhouses increased. Others suggest it's been fragmented and romanticized in recent years, especially with the rise of Nordic wellness tourism. But whether it's mythology or memory, one truth remains. In places where nature cannot be ignored, the body learns to listen. The ice is not just cold. It is conversation. Between temperature and thought, between fear and acceptance, between the self we performed, the self that remains when breath is shallow and skin meets snow. So the next time you see someone step into a frozen lake, don't just watch their courage. Watch their stillness after. Because in that trembling exhale, beneath frost and silence, something ancient survives. In a forest shrine in Japan, as dawn pierces the mist and the air hums with stillness, a figure stands beneath a waterfall. Robes soaked, breath steady, eyes closed. The water crashes cold against their back. Not for seconds, but for minutes. This is not punishment. This is ancient Shinto purification ritual. Here, cold water isn't about health or bravery. It's about cleansing the soul. Misogi is one of Japan's oldest spiritual practices, and at its heart lies a simple idea. Before approaching the sacred, you must first become clean, not just physically, but spiritually, energetically. And for thousands of years, the most direct way to do that was to stand in cold, flowing water, letting it strip away impurity both seen and unseen. The practice often begins before sunrise. Participants walk barefoot into rivers or stand under waterfalls, some natural, some fed by carefully channeled springs. They chant, they bow, they center themselves, and then they enter the water. What happens next is something that transcends comfort. The cold hits, the breath tightens, but slowly through repetition, rhythm, presence, it settles. Some say it feels like dying and being reborn. Others call it silence in motion. Shinto, the indigenous spirituality of Japan, doesn't have strict doctrine. It reveres nature, ancestry, and the invisible forces that animate the world called kami. And these kami are believed to reside in places that are pure, forests, rivers, stones. So to commune with them, one must match that purity. Misogi isn't just an individual act. Entire groups train in it, especially before significant events. Martial artists, shrine keepers, and sometimes even corporate teams participate together. And while there are now softer, symbolic versions of Misogi as rinsing hands and mouth at shrine entrances, original ritual remains icy and visceral. Interestingly, some Buddhist sects in Japan also incorporated cold water immersion into their training, particularly in the practice of Shugyo austerity training. Monks in the Tendai tradition have been known to douse themselves repeatedly in freezing mountain streams as a form of mental sharpening and ego dissolution. But scholars remain divided. Some argue that the link between cold water and spiritual awakening is more cultural than universal. That Japanese traditions assigned meaning to cold because of their geographical context-abundant mountains, clean rivers, a strong seasonal cycle. Others believe there's something archetypal in it, cold as symbolic death, cleansing as rebirth. A story older than language. Either way, the emotional effect is striking. Even modern-day participants, teenagers, office workers, YouTubers report a kind of inner hush after their first real Misogi. They don't talk about the pain. They talk about the quiet, about a moment when their thoughts finally stopped chasing each other. In that sense, Misogi is perhaps less about religion and more about presence. The water forces you into the now. There is no past, no future, just cold and breath. In one small village outside Kyoto, an elder priest once said during an interview, "The body remembers the cold, but the soul remembers the stillness." Today, some Western practitioners attempt their own versions of Misogi, often blending it with breathwork or meditation. But without the surrounding belief system, the effect can feel incomplete. Because Misogi isn't just about stepping into cold water. It's about doing so with intentionas, a ritual of return. Return to stillness. Return to humility. Return to something you lost, perhaps in the noise of modern life. So when you see someone bow before a stream, eyes closed, palms pressed, then step forward into the flow, know this: they are not braving the cold, they are inviting it. Because on the other side of discomfort, they believe, is clarity. Midnight in a stone-walled monastery. The air is cold, silent, and still. In a narrow cell, a monk kneels beside a wooden bucket, its contents shimmering in the dim candlelight. With a practiced motion, he lifts the ladle, tips it forward, and pours the freezing water over his own shoulders. Again and again. Each splash a ritual, each drop a whisper of repentance. This was not uncommon in medieval Europe. For many monks, cold water was not a tool for revival, it was a method of discipline, of humility, and, at times, punishment. Welcome to the era where cold meant contrition. In Christian monastic traditions, particularly in the early centuries of the Middle Ages, self-mortification, putting the body through discomfort, was seen as a path to purifying the soul. Monks slept on stone floors, fasted for weeks, wore hair shirts that scratched and irritated the skin, and yes, they bathed in cold water. Not to feel alive, but to feel small before God. The idea was simple. The body is flawed, the soul must dominate it. And nothing reminded the flesh of its limits more directly than cold. Historical documents from Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries include mentions of icy baths used not just for hygiene, but for penance. A monk who fell into temptation might be ordered to bathe in the river before morning prayer. Another might kneel in a trough of water during winter, repeating psalms as punishment for pride or disobedience. Was it harsh? Yes, but it was also voluntary. This practice wasn't about torture, it was about shaping the will. For these men, who had renounced the world to live in devotion, the cold became a tool, a reminder that comfort was not the goal. Closeness to God was. Interestingly, not all historians agree on how widespread or systematized these practices were. Some argue they were isolated acts of extreme devotion, exaggerated in later texts. Others point to detailed monastic records that describe cold immersion as part of routine penance, especially in colder climates like the British Isles or the mountainous regions of France. One chilling story from a 12th century abbey describes a monk who, plagued by impure thoughts, stood in a freezing stream at dawn each day for weeks, praying until his lips turned blue. The account is written with reverence, not pity. He was considered holy, purified. But what's most fascinating is how cold water in this context was not feared. It was embraced. Some monks even reported mystical experiences during these moments' visions. Silence, a sense of profound clarity. They described the cold as burning away the ego. One passage reads, "In water colder than death, I heard no voice but my own return." Modern psychology might call this a dissociative response, the mind detaching from the body under stress. But perhaps, in the absence of distractions, of noise, of worldly stimulation, that stark cold did bring them closer to something. And yet, the legacy of these practices is complicated. Some monasteries later banned extreme cold exposure, concerned for the health of aging monks. Others gradually replaced it with symbolic gestures, kneeling on cold stone, fasting in silence. The act remained. The water was removed. Still, echoes of this tradition survive. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, cold water immersion is part of Epiphany rituals to this day. Priests bless rivers. Believers plunge in, symbolizing the baptism of Christ. It's not penance anymore. It's devotion, a joyful discomfort. But the spiritual root is the same. Cold as a portal. Cold as surrender. Not to test willpower, but to empty the self so something greater might enter. So when you think of monks and medieval asceticism, don't just picture cloisters and candlelight. Picture the quiet splash of water in a stone basin. Picture breath rising in a frozen cell. Picture the trembling exhale of a man who has given up everything, and in that icy moment believes he has found truth. In the ornate drawing rooms of 19th century England, where lace curtains filtered soft afternoon light, and everything from posture to punctuation followed rules, a surprising trend was quietly making its way into polite society: ice-cold baths. But this wasn't about athletic recovery or spiritual awakening. Number in Victorian Britain, cold water was something altogether different, a moral statement. At the heart of this movement was the belief that discipline of the body led to discipline of the mind and the soul. And what better way to train both than by stepping into a freezing tub every morning? Among the upper and aspiring middle classes, cold water immersion became associated with purity, self-control, and curiously virtue. Warm water, on the other hand, was suspect. It was thought to encourage laziness, vanity, even sensual temptation. The colder the bath, the more upright the character. This wasn't just personal preference, it was deeply ideological. In fact, many of the day's moral reformers advocated cold bathing in schools, orphanages, and boarding houses. Influential figures like Thomas Arnold, headmaster of Rugby School, promoted cold showers for students as part of a regimen of moral hardening. A boy who could withstand cold, it was believed, could withstand vice. The famed medical journal, The Lancet, even published articles praising the benefits of cold immersion, not necessarily for health, but for character building. One piece read, "There is no finer measure of resolve than the daily plunge into water that neither invites nor forgives." But was it effective? That depends on who you ask. Some Victorian physicians swore by it, claiming cold baths improved circulation, cured melancholy, and restored the nerves. Others criticized the trend, especially when applied to children, the elderly, or the ill. Reports began to surface of pneumonia outbreaks in institutions that insisted on frigid bathing, even during winter. Still, the practice endured, especially among the elite, who saw it as a marker of restraint and refinement. Even Queen Victoria herself was said to favor a brisk sponge bath in the morning, not boiling hot, but modestly chilled. Her physicians prescribed it not for health, but to uphold a royal image of stoicism and composure. In private diaries and letters of the era, you'll often find references to bracing the tub or earning one's breakfast through cold ablution. It became a kind of quiet performansone that mirrored the strict social codes of the time. What's lesser known is how cold water also became part of moral reform movements. In the early 1800s, religious temperance societies across England and North America began to link cold bathing with sobriety, arguing that it helps stave off impure urges. Some public bathhouses, sponsored by these groups, offered free cold baths to the working class, not to refresh the body, but to cleanse the will. But as with all historical trends, cold bathing was layered with contradiction. Because while upper-class Victorians championed icy water as virtuous, they also lived in homes with heated floors, servants, and libraries full of soft velvet chairs. The discomfort they embraced each morning was carefully contained a symbolic shiver, not true hardship. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on everyone. Some social commentators of the time mocked the practice, calling it ritual suffering for the already comfortable. Others pointed out the danger of prescribing cold baths to the poor, whose bodies were already weakened by labor and hunger. Still, the cold bath persisted, not because it was pleasurable, but because it offered a mirror, a way to see oneself as strong, moral, and in control. And even now, that Victorian logic lingers. You hear it in phrases like, "Get out of your comfort zone. Start the day with something hard. Discomfort builds discipline." Today's ice bath influencers might not wear waistcoats or read Dickens, but the message is familiar. Cold water isn't just therapy. It's a signal to yourself and to others that you are serious about becoming better. So the next time you see someone dunking into a tub of ice in a luxury wellness studio, you might wonder, are they seeking health or morality? Mud, blood, frost, silence. In the trenches of World War I, There were mornings when soldiers woke with ice on their boots, when sleep came in shallow fragments, and Washinjivan briefly meant exposing already numb fingers to icy water in metal tins. And yet, in these brutal environments, cold water remained part of the ritual, not for hygiene, not for refreshment, but as a kind of grounding, a tether. During both world wars, soldiers encountered cold water not just as discomfort, but sometimes strangely as relief. It wasn't unusual for men to plunge their hands into rivers, soak their heads in buckets, or dunk their feet in basins of cold, trying to shake off the fog of combat or exhaustion. Cold water became, for many, a way to return to their senses when the world felt otherwise unreal. Field manuals from the early 20th century occasionally mention cold immersion as a nerve tonic, especially in the context of shell shock, what we now call PTSD. The theory, though crude, was simple. If someone became disoriented, frozen by fear, or collapsed into withdrawal, shock treatment by cold might jolt them back into the present. Some medics carried buckets or flasks of cold water, not for cleaning wounds, but for splashing soldiers who couldn't speak or move. It was a kind of crude reset, but this was far from consistent. The use of cold water in wartime recovery straddled a strange line between care and coercion. In some cases, it helped. In others, it hurt. In fact, military historians are still divided. Some suggest that these practices, though anecdotal, reflected a larger truth. The body sometimes responds to extreme sensation when language and logic fail. Others argue that cold immersion, used without psychological understanding, may have deepened trauma in already fragile minds. The medical records from those years are sparse, fragmented. But the memoirs tell a deeper story. Soldiers wrote about plunging their arms into icy rivers just to feel again, about holding snow to their faces during panic attacks, about using the cold as an anchor away to remember they were still alive. One letter from a French infantryman, dated 1917, reads, "I could not hear the shells anymore, but I felt the water. It reminded me of childhood. That hurt more than the war. And here lies a paradox. Cold water during war was not healing, but it was human. Even in World War II, the tradition continued. In field hospitals, nurses sometimes used cold compresses on men experiencing nervous tremors. In frozen forests of Eastern Europe, Soviet soldiers were known to cut holes in ice to wash, not out of necessity, but because it made them feel like themselves again, however briefly. One account from a Red Army veteran describes sitting shirtless beside a frozen river, splashing cold water over his chest while enemy artillery thundered nearby. His commander asked him if he was mad. He replied, "I needed to feel something that wasn't fear. There are no controlled studies from those trenches, no biomarkers or brain scans. Only stories, fragments, ripples of meaning. But one thing is clear. In the most extreme moments of human conflict, cold water became a kind of silent language. It said, 'You are still here. You can still feel. You are not yet lost.' Today, veterans still speak of cold as a memory trigger. For some, it's unbearable. For others, it's grounding. A bath, a splash, a sudden chill can return them painfully or tenderly to a moment they thought forgotten. And the science? Modern trauma therapists have begun to explore cold exposure as a nervous system regulatory way to interrupt spirals of anxiety or flashbacks, not as cure, but as a bridge from panic to presence, from dissociation to now. But the field is still young. Some experts warn against its use without context or support. The body may remember, but it doesn't always heal on cue. Still, one thing remains. Even in war, even in horror, cold water had power, not to erase, but to wake, and sometimes that was enough. A snow-covered stadium, a crowd wrapped in wool and fur, the river nearby frozen solid. And in the center of it all, dozens of people barefoot, half-dressed plunging into icy water one after another, each one cheered like a champion. This wasn't a punishment or an act of desperation. It was a tradition, and it was a sport. From Soviet Russia to modern Canada, from Nordic lakes to Polish mountains, cold water immersion evolved not just into ritual, but into challenge. A public test of will, of strength, of identity. We call it winter swimming today, but its roots lie in something deeper. The belief that voluntarily facing the cold proves something essential about the self. In the early 20th century, the Soviet Union began organizing official cold water competitions not just for sport but for ideological reasons. The Soviet state was fascinated by hardened bodies and cold resistance as signs of the ideal citizen, strong, obedient, resilient in any environment. Icy swims became patriotic acts. Endurance equaled loyalty. Children were sometimes trained to stand barefoot in snow or rinse themselves in cold basins before school. Posters declared, "Temper the body, strengthen the revolution." But this wasn't unique to the USSR. In post-war Czechoslovakia, polar bear clubs formed. In Finland and Sweden, lakeside communities organized regular dips in freezing water, not for political virtue, but for personal discipline. The body, stripped of comfort, became a tool for self-knowledge. The culture of challenge spread westward in waves. In the United States, Canada, and the UK, winter swims became seasonal spectacles. Polar plunges were held on New Year's Day often to raise money for charity, but also as symbolic resets. A way to start the year braver, cleaner, renewed. By the late 20th century, a new breed of endurance seekers emerged. Biohackers, extreme athletes, motivational speakers. And they saw in cold water not just a ritual, but a frontier. This is where the language began to shift. No longer just about health or tradition, cold immersion became part of self-optimization. The body was no longer just to be tested, it was to be trained, sculpted, upgraded. Cold water was described as a mental forge, a dopamine pump, a disciplined shortcut. Entire online communities formed around daily cold showers, ice baths, snow runs. Men and women recorded their trembling exhalations in 4K resolution. "I didn't want to do this," they'd say, "but I did it anyway." And in that moment, shared, tagged, looped, and reposted the cold became content. Sociologists now call this the aestheticization of resilience, the transformation of raw human struggle into something performative. To do hard things not just for their own sake, but for the narrative they create. And yet, it's important not to dismiss it all as show, Because even now, among all the digital noise and influencer sound bites, something real often happens in that water. Something older than cameras. The breath holds. The heart surges. The mind quiets. Even when the audience is watching, the cold still tells the truth. Interestingly, academic studies show that people who regularly engage in cold water challenges often report heightened emotional regulation, improved stress response, and an increased sense of personal agency. But researchers are careful with conclusions. Many admit, we don't fully understand why this works, we just know it often does. That uncertainty is part of the magic. And perhaps that's why cold challenges continue not just because they look impressive, but because they reconnect us to something primal. In a world of screens and schedules, of climate control and convenience, plunging into ice water isn't just difficult. It's rare. Rare to feel your limits. Rare to see yourself stripped of roles and routines. Rare to meet discomfort without distraction. So when you see someone lower themselves into a frozen lake, camera or no camera, consider this. They're not just chasing attention. They're chasing realness. And in that moment, shivering, gasping, alive, they might just catch it. A lab in the Netherlands. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Electrodes are attached to skin. Ice baths wait nearby, perfectly chilled. The subject? Calm, shirtless, cross-legged, breathing deep, long inhale, sharp exhale. Again and again. The scientist signals. He enters the bath. This is where ancient instinct meets modern inquiry, where researchers try to measure the magic of cold water. And for decades now, scientists across the world have been asking a deceptively simple question. What does cold exposure actually do to the human body? Some of the earliest controlled studies go back to the mid-20th century. Military researchers wanted to understand hypothermia and survival. Athletes wanted to know if ice baths improved recovery. Doctors wondered if there were cognitive effects. What they found was fascinating, if not always conclusive. One of the most consistent discoveries is that cold water triggers the cold shock response. The body instantly reacts. Heart rate spikes, blood vessels constrict, breathing becomes rapid and shallow. Adrenaline floods the system. This reaction is ancient design to protect us from sudden immersion. But what happens next is more subtle. Within minutes, if one stays calm, the body starts to adapt. Breathing slows. Endorphins release. Blood reroutes toward the core. For some, this leads to a sensation of mental clarity, even euphoria. This has led scientists to explore whether cold exposure might benefit mood disorders like anxiety or depression. Several small studies suggest that regular cold showers can lead to mild improvements in mood and energy, possibly due to neurotransmitter activity like norepinephrine and dopamine. But, and this is important, not all studies agree. Some researchers argue that the effects are short-lived. Others note that the data is anecdotal or based on self-reporting. There are even suggestions that belief in the cold's benefits, rather than the cold itself, may explain much of the perceived improvement. The academic community remains divided. One neuroscientist famously stated, "Cold exposure is either revolutionary or just a very loud placebo." Still, the questions haven't gone away. If anything, they've multiplied. Can cold water reduce inflammation? Can it boost immune function? Can it protect the brain from degenerative diseases? Some researchers think yes. Others say more trials are needed. One study found that brief cold immersion may slightly increase white blood cell count. Another observed that long-term cold water swimmers had lower markers of systemic inflammation, but cause and correlation are tricky. Were these people healthier because of the colder? Were only healthy people drawn to such extreme routines? And then there's the Wim Hof effect. The Dutchman, known as the Iceman, has captivated scientists with his ability to endure extreme cold, control heart rate, and even resist illness, all through a combination of breathing techniques, meditation, and cold exposure. In 2014, a landmark study showed that volunteers trained by Hof were able to voluntarily influence their immune responses after being injected with endotoxin. That shouldn't be possible, yet it happened. Was it the cold? The breath work? The mindset? No one's sure. Even the scientists admitted this challenges established medical understanding. Since then, universities have been racing to replicate and decode Hof's method. Some suspect it's a combination of controlled stress and mental focus, not magic, but a rare intersection of biology and belief. But Hof is not the only case. Across different labs, scientists have observed monks, free divers, and winter swimmers showing unique physiological patterns, from lowered cortisol levels to enhanced vagal tone. Cold, it seems, is a kind of human laboratory, a place where the mind, body, and breath intersect. Yet every breakthrough raises more questions. How much cold is safe? How long is too long? Why do some people thrive in it, while others panic? There are no universal answers, only patterns. But one thing is certain. Cold water forces the body to decide, quickly fight, flee, or adapt. And in that adaptation, something remarkable happens. Not just physically, but mentally. As one researcher said after watching dozens of participants emerge from the ice, they all look different. Not afraid, not proud, just present. And maybe that's what the science can't fully measure. The quiet, sharpened awareness. The breath that says, I'm here, fully. Because data may debate the benefits, but experience rarely does. A man sits shirtless in the snow, his breath rising in clouds, his eyes closed in stillness. Around him, cameras click. Scientists watch. The temperature drops below freezing, but he doesn't shiver. Minutes pass. Then hours. This is Wim Hof, and to millions he is known as the Iceman. But who is he really? And why has his name become synonymous with cold water transcendence? Wim Hof's story begins, unexpectedly, with grief. In the 1990s, after the sudden death of his wife, Hof fell into a deep depression. Searching for a way out, not in books or therapists, but in the elements, he began immersing himself in ice-cold lakes and rivers, often alone. It wasn't an experiment, it was survival. What he discovered changed his life, and, eventually, the lives of many others. By the early 2000s, Hof had developed what he now calls the Wim Hof Method blend of cold exposure, controlled breathing, and mental focus. He began setting world records. longest swim under ice, marathon above the Arctic Circle barefoot, full-body immersion in ice for nearly 2 hours. At first, he was dismissed as a stuntman, but then came the science. In 2014, a landmark study at Radboud University tested Hof's claims. He trained a group of volunteers in his method. Then, under medical supervision, they were injected with endotoxin, a bacterial compound known to cause violent flu-like symptoms. To everyone's surprise, the volunteers not only tolerated the injection, they suppressed their inflammatory response. Fever, nausea, fatigue, and none of it happened. The researchers were stunned. For decades, the autonomic nervous system was considered involuntary beyond conscious control. Yet here was a group of people apparently willing their bodies to stay calm. It wasn't magic, it was method. But where did this method come from? Wim Hof himself claims he did not invent it, he rediscovered it. He often references ancient Tibetan tumo breathing, a meditative heat-generating practice used by monks in the Himalayas. He also speaks of shamanic wisdom, yogic roots, and nature's guidance. Yet scholars remain divided. Some argue that Hof's method is a synthesis of old techniques adapted for modern bodies. Others caution against tracing direct lineage. The breathing Hof teaches, after all, is more forceful than meditative, more rhythmic than reflective. It's westernized resilience, not Eastern stillness. And that's part of its appeal. The Wim Hof method doesn't require monasteries, long training, or cultural immersion. It needs only a bathtub, some discipline, and a willingness to shiver. This accessibility is key to its global spread. Online courses, retreats, abstins of thousands now practice Hof's techniques. Doctors, athletes, artists, CEOs, even trauma survivors. Many report remarkable outcomes. Increased energy, less stress, heightened focus, deeper sleep. But not all outcomes are positive. Some medical experts warn that cold exposure without preparation can be dangerous, leading to hyperventilation, fainting, or even heart issues. In rare cases, individuals have drowned during unsupervised breath-hold practices. The science remains intrigued but cautious. While preliminary research shows promise, especially in autoimmune regulation and mental resilience, long-term effects are not fully understood. There's no universal protocol, no guarantees. Yet, beyond the data, there's something undeniably archetypal about Wim Hof's rise. He is a modern embodiment of an ancient idea that the elements can heal, that pain, if entered voluntarily, can become transformation. When Hof speaks to his audience, it's rarely technical. He says things like, "Feel the cold, love the cold. The cold is a teacher." And people believe him, because when they step into the water guided by breath, softened by trust, they often feel something ancient stir inside. A memory, a strength, a stillness. So whether or not Hof's method is the ultimate blueprint for health, it has already done something powerful. It's returned cold water to the collective imagination, not as punishment, but as awakening. And in doing so, it's helped thousands step back into their bodies, into the breath, into now. A sleek studio in Los Angeles. Glass walls, minimalist decor, ambient music humming low. A white tub sits in the center of the room, filled not with warm bubbles, but with crystal clear ice water. A timer glows on a screen nearby. A coach kneels beside the tub, whispering, "Breathe in, breathe out, let go." This is not a clinic, not a science lab. It's a wellness center. And today, across cities from Tokyo to Toronto, cold water immersion has become one of the most popular and profitable tools in the global self-optimization industry. But how did a practice once rooted in monasteries, trenches, and tradition become the new face of urban luxury and peak performance? The answer lies in two words: control and transformation. In a time when life feels uncertain, climate, economy, technology, identity, people crave rituals that make them feel powerful. And cold exposure, with its immediate physical jolt and dramatic imagery, offers a perfect solution. A controlled hardship wrapped in aesthetics, promising change. Step into the ice, and you're no longer passive. You're choosing discomfort. You're proving something to yourself and the world. It's no wonder that wellness brands have rushed to capitalize. High-end recovery studios now offer cold plunges at $40 a session. Influencers post before and after shots, showing themselves calm and centered after a 2-minute immersion. Subscription services deliver home ice baths in stylish tubs made of carbon fiber and steel. There are apps to track your cold progress, breathwork playlists on Spotify, even guided meditations titled Ice Mindset. Cold water has become a lifestyle product. But beneath the branding lies a deeper question. Does it actually work? For many users, yes, at least subjectively. They report reduced stress, sharper focus, better sleep. Athletes say their muscles recover faster. Entrepreneurs claim their minds feel rewired after a morning plunge. Even celebrities Gwyneth Paltrow, Jack Dorsey, Lady Gaga publicly advocate cold immersion as part of their wellness routines. But scientists remain cautious. While there is moderate evidence that cold water can reduce inflammation and stimulate certain neurotransmitters, it's not a miracle cure, and it certainly doesn't replace therapy, nutrition, or proper medical care. Still, one thing is clear. Cold water works well in metaphor. It has become a mirror for modern ambition. Just as Victorians used cold baths to prove virtue, today's strivers use them to signal mental resilience. The tub becomes a confessional, the pain a performance. And this performance has a very specific aesthetic: minimalist, silent, clean. Unlike the raw chaos of Arctic plunges or traditional shamanic rites, today's cold immersion is sleek and scripted. Think spa-like tiles. Think soft lighting. Think Instagram-ready moments of agony and transcendence. In many ways, it's been gentrified. Yet something interesting happens in these glossy spaces. People still shake. People still gasp. People still cry. Because no matter how modern the setting, the water hasn't changed. It is still cold. It still strips away pretense. And in that moment, when your breath catches and time narrows theirs, no branding, no lifestyle, just you and the cold and a single thought: I am alive. Some critics argue that the commercialization of cold immersion dilutes its power, that when a ritual becomes a service, something sacred is lost. Others believe that accessibility, even through commerce, brings ancient practices to those who need them most. Academic voices remain divided. One cultural theorist notes, "Cold immersion today walks a strange line, part healing, part flex, part therapy, part theater." But perhaps that's the point. Like all rituals, it evolves. And if stepping into ice, even surrounded by eucalyptus towels and ambient light, helps someone return to their body, to breath, to stillness, then maybe the form doesn't matter. Maybe the cold, in any vessel, still carries its message. Not to impress, but to interrupt, to stop the scroll, to cut through the noise, to bring you back to something ancient. So whether it's in a forest stream or a curated wellness lounge, when the water hits and you breathe through it, you are not chasing status. You are reminding yourself you can begin again. An athlete stands in a locker room, sweat still fresh on their skin, muscles aching, breath shallow. Behind them, a metal tub waits filled to the brim with water and ice. The trainer gives a nod. They step in slowly, ankles, knees, waist, and then the exhale. This is no ritual of faith or cultural memory. It's recovery science, or at least that's what it's trying to be. Because in the world of elite sports, cold water immersion has become a near universal tool embraced by marathoners, MMA fighters, footballers, ballerinas, gymnasts. You'll find it in Olympic villages and behind the scenes at the Super Bowl. The logic seems obvious. Strain the body, then chill it down. Flush out fatigue. Reset the system. But like much in the cold water story, the science is more complex than it seems. Let's start with the basic theory. After intense physical activity, muscles experience microtraumatiny, tears that lead to inflammation, soreness, and sometimes swelling. By plunging into cold water, especially between 10-15 degrees Celsius, 50-59 degrees Fahrenheit, blood vessels constrict, reducing blood flow to the area. This is called vasoconstriction. Once the body warms again, the vessels dilate, bringing in fresh blood, oxygen, and nutrients. This process is believed to accelerate recovery, reduce soreness, and limit inflammation. That's the theory. And some studies do back it up, particularly in high-impact sports. Athletes who use cold immersion immediately after competition often report less soreness and faster muscle return within 24 to 48 hours. Boothers, where it gets interesting. Other studies suggest that too much cold might blunt adaptation. That is, while it reduces short-term pain, it may also slow down muscle growth and long-term performance gains. Especially in strength-based sports, like weightlifting or sprinting, inflammation is part of the growth signal. Blunting it too quickly may, paradoxically, stunt recovery. So the sports science community is divided. Use cold for comfort and quick turnaround? Yes. Use it every day? Maybe not. In fact, some trainers now only apply cold immersion during tournaments or congested schedules when recovery speed is critical, between matches, for example, or during multi-day competitions. For general training, they let soreness run its course. And it's not just about muscles. Athletes also speak of mental reset. Cold water offers a chance to refocus, to breathe deeply, to clear the noise of loss or the adrenaline of victory. In this way, it becomes a ritual of return, stepping into ice not just to heal, but to be whole again. You'll hear the same phrases in post-game interviews. It helps me feel centered. I need that shock to shake it off. The ice clears my head. Interestingly, this intersects with another trend: pre-performance cold exposure. Some teams now experiment with short cold plunges before games, not for muscle relief, but for alertness. A 2-minute immersion at low temps has been shown to boost norepinephrine and dopamine, increasing focus and reaction time. It's not universal, and the protocols vary widely. But again, the theme is consistent. Cold sharpens presence. And presence is everything in competition. Yet, the cold immersion ritual in sports is also psychological. To step into freezing water requires volition, discipline. It mimics the core challenge of elite performance, facing discomfort and choosing to continue. Coaches know this. That's why ice baths are sometimes used not just for recovery, but for character assessment. Who enters willingly? Who avoids it? Who learns to breathe through it? In that tub, ego meets edge. And sometimes, what emerges is more than an athlete. It's a person reconnected to body, breath, and will. Still, no protocol is perfect. Some athletes develop cold tolerance quickly. Others never adjust. One NBA player once said, "It's not the cold that gets you. It's what the cold shows you about yourself." In that sense, the post-game ice bath is more than science. It's a mirror, not just of the body's limits, but of how we meet them. So, while the science continues to evolve debating optimal timing, temperature, and duration, the experience remains the same. Cold, breath, focus, and the silent realization, again and again, you can endure. Dawn breaks over a quiet suburb. A man steps into his backyard, exhales slowly, and lifts the lid of a wooden tub. Steam curls off his breath as he slides into the cold. It's only 7 degrees Celsius, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. His muscles tighten. His eyes close. He doesn't move for 2 minutes. He's not a monk, not a soldier, not a scientist, just someone starting his day. This is the face of cold immersion in the age of self-care. Unlike ancient rituals or elite sports regimens, the modern home cold plunge is often quiet, solitary, and deeply personal. It's not about penance or performance. It's about ritualized resilience in an increasingly chaotic world. Over the last 5 years, cold exposure has moved from fringe wellness into the mainstream, driven by a convergence of factors: stress culture, mental health awareness, TikTok virality, and a growing distrust in pharmaceutical-only solutions. And now, in bathrooms, garages, backyards, and even offices, people are building their own micro-sanctuaries of discomfort. Steel tubs, DIY ice barrels, high-tech chillers. What was once elite is now accessible with entire online communities dedicated to temperature ranges, breathing protocols, and personal breakthroughs. But what exactly are people seeking in this routine? For some, it's about mental clarity, waking up the brain without caffeine. For others, it's about discipline, starting each morning with a voluntary challenge. But for a growing number, it's about anxiety regulation. Because when the world feels too fast, too loud, too uncertain, cold immersion offers one thing: immediacy. You can't worry about deadlines in 6 degrees Celsius water. You can't ruminate on past regrets when your breath is clipped by ice. The cold demands presence, and in that presence many find peace. Psychologists call this somatic anchoring, the process of using the body to pull the mind into now. And while not a substitute for therapy, many therapists have begun to explore cold exposure as a complementary practice, particularly for clients dealing with burnout, intrusive thoughts, or dissociation. But again, the academic field is cautious. Some experts warn that cold immersion can trigger vasovagal responses, dizziness, fainting, even panics, especially in those with cardiac conditions. Others note that while cold can be clarifying, it can also become addictive, especially when used to chase dopamine spikes. So where's the line? That, it seems, depends on the intention behind the ritual. The most effective practices, according to psychologists and seasoned users alike, are those anchored in awareness, not chasing an image, but cultivating a felt relationship with sensation. And that's where the modern cold immersion shines, when it becomes a kind of quiet conversation with oneself. Many who practice daily or weekly describe it not as a challenge, but as a reset. They speak of mornings where anxiety dissolved in 3 slow breaths, of days when the cold taught them patience, of moments when the water held them more kindly than the world did. There's something poetic in that, because unlike exercise, meditation, or journaling, cold immersion doesn't require belief. You don't need to get it right. You just need to enter, to feel, to stay. And the ritual is often simple. Open the tub. Watch your thoughts try to talk you out of it. Step in. Let the breath shorten. Let it lengthen. Let everything else fall away. 2 minutes later, you emerge different, and yet completely so. You haven't changed the world, but you've changed how you meet it. And in an age defined by overstimulation and underrest, that may be one of the most radical acts left. To willingly step into the cold and find stillness. A child dips their toes into a mountain stream. The water is glacial pure, sharp, almost too bright to feel. They squeal, pull back, then try again. Somewhere behind them, a parent watches, smiling. It's a simple moment. No timer, no breathing protocol, no hashtag, just curiosity, courage, and the cold. And maybe that's where this whole story circles back, to the beginning, because long before cold water was branded, studied, spiritualized, or marketed, it was simply there. A river to cross, a wave to wade through, a storm to endure, a moment to feel the full edge of being alive. Across history, across culture, across belief, cold water has always been more than sensation. It has been language, and that language speaks in whispers most of us forget to hear. You are not in control. You are more than you thought. You are still here. Some traditions gave it meaning. Others gave it rules. Some feared it. Others welcomed it. But beneath it all, the body has always known what to do. Shiver, tighten, breathe, adapt. Remember, and that memory of survival, of clarity, of presence is what keeps calling people back. Not just monks in stone monasteries or elite athletes in recovery rooms, but everyday people. People with deadlines, debts, and dreams. People seeking silence or strength or something they can't yet name. And that's perhaps the real reason the cold has returned, not as novelty, but as need. Because in a world that moves faster than ever, filled with synthetic ease and digital noise, cold water remains one of the few experiences that cannot be faked. You cannot scroll through it. You cannot buy your way around it. You cannot skip to the part where it feels good. You must enter. You must surrender. You must breathe through it. And in doing so, something ancient wakes up. Not just the nervous system, but the knowing that the body is not just a tool or a burden. It is a guide, a mirror, a gatekeeper to states of consciousness that the mind, on its own, can't quite reach. So maybe the question is not, why do people take cold showers? But rather, what are they returning to when they do? It could be resilience, or reverence, or just the pause between chaos and clarity. And perhaps that's the quiet gift of cold. It reminds you that you don't need more to be whole. You just need to feel completely, even if only for 90 seconds. That the body, when held by discomfort, reveals truths the mind forgot. And maybe, in that chill, you are reborn. And now, as the night deepens, as our breath slows together, feel how even the idea of cold begins to soften. No more plunges, no more shock, just a long exhale, like mist rising from a winter lake at sunrise. Let your thoughts melt gently like ice on skin. Let your heart settle into stillness, the kind that only comes after being truly awake. You're not bracing anymore. You're floating. There's nothing left to prove tonight, nothing left to resist. Only this quiet moment, this breath, this warmth curling back into your chest. So sleep now, brave traveler of stories. Let the cold stay behind the glass, where it belongs. You've walked far tonight and returned whole.